Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me this morning. Sorry about the changes in the schedules. My schedule has changed somewhat, and so I've had to move things around a bit. But we're towards the end of this, and so it shouldn't affect our reading this book too much. In church, we mentioned that we're doing the last chapter. This is not the last chapter. So this is the next to the last chapter, and even this chapter is going to have to be divided into two because there are two very dominant themes that take place in chapter 13 that they just need to be separated and so that adequate time can be given to each of these themes in chapter 13. So chapter 13 is a continuation of what took place in chapter 12. And in chapter 12, the main character and his mentor, MacDonald, come across this amazing woman who is making her way through the forest, and she's accompanied by this parade of magnificent people who are celebrating, dancing, playing music, and clearly this woman is being given honor for the way in which she lived her life on earth. She was a remarkable person. Her name was Sarah Smith. And so what made her remarkable was how she lived her life faithfully despite onerous and difficult circumstances that she could not get away from. So she was the type of person whom, when she lived her life, she just made people around her better. When she encountered children, the children would go home and see their mother in a different light and see their mother better. When men encountered her, they would go home and be better husbands to their wives. When animals, came across her and she engaged them, they too became better animals. She was just a vivacious, a person who was incredibly full of substance, and so because of the fruit that she was able to produce with her life, in light of terribly difficult circumstances, she was this amazing person whom was honored magnificently in heaven. And so you get this picture of this person. So the main character and MacDonald run across her, and before long they encounter what appears to be a dwarf and a tragedian. A tragedian is an actor who specializes in melodramas, who usually is this tragic figure, tragic because of how circumstances impact them, and you're supposed to feel sorry. And so the way in which Lewis describes this tragedian is that he is a very tall, thin, very dramatic figure that you would see on a New York stage. And then the dwarf was the real person. So the dwarf was the real person. The tragedian was a manifestation of the dwarf himself. In other words, it's how he presented himself. So his way of thinking, his way of behaving, the way in which he conducted himself was projected outwardly as this tragedian. So I hope that makes sense to you. If it doesn't make sense, tell me on the line there. But in essence, the dwarf is the real person that at one point was married to Sarah Smith, not as a dwarf, but as a person like an adult grown male. But the fact that he is a dwarf in heaven is symbolic of how his character made him shrink, and he emanated himself in a way that he tried to. So he emanated himself in the form of this tragedy, and he was connected by a chain. So the dwarf had this chain, and through that chain, he would communicate. He would speak as the tragedian. In most cases, he hardly spoke at all. It was the tragedian that spoke for him, this emanation of himself, how he projected this drama of who he was in the form of this tragedy, and in an effort to try to manipulate and coerce people to his side and to what it was that he wanted. So it's a clever way of Lewis trying to demonstrate how, of how people can project themselves to others. So what we see is their projection, and what we don't see is what they really are in all of their fullness. So we all know people who are all about drama, and so when we encounter them, it's the drama that we encounter, not the real them, the drama. And so this is kind of like what's going on here as Lewis paints it. But Sarah, when she encounters this dwarf and the tragedian, she never speaks to the tragedian. She never speaks to the projection. She only speaks to the dwarf, and the dwarf's name is Frank. So you have MacDonald, who is the main character, the heavenly being. You have the human main character, or the unglorified main character, who's been with MacDonald throughout much of the story. And then you have Sarah Smith, this magnificent person. And then you have the tragedian and the dwarf. So those are the 4.5 kind of main characters in the story itself. So Sarah, in essence, is trying to encourage the dwarf to let go of the tragedy and to let go of the drama, to let go of the way in which he would manipulate people, to let go of this false projection of himself, and to see heaven for all of its glory and for what it really is. The dwarf, on the other hand, is trying to use the tragedy and to make Sarah feel guilty so that he can manipulate her and try to control her in the same way that he tried to control her while they were on Earth. So it would appear as if Sarah is having some real impact on the dwarf, as she tries to encourage him to rethink who he really is and what he really ought to be about. So we come now to chapter 13. And so so what had just happened in chapter 12 was that Sarah said something in such a way that the dwarf was now considering her proposal. And so this is where we pick it up. I do not know that I ever saw anything more terrible than the struggle of that dwarf against joy, for he had almost been overcome. Somewhere, incalculable ages ago, there must have been gleams of humor and reason in him. For one moment, while she looked at him in her love and mirth, he saw the absurdity of the tragedy. And so now, her witness, her example enabled him to see the absurdity of this projection of himself for one moment. So for one moment, he did not at all misunderstand her laughter. He too must have once known that no people find each other more absurd than lovers. But the light that reached him reached him against his will. This was not the meeting he had pictured. He would not accept it. Once more he clutched at his death line. At once the tragedian spoke. So, Lewis is painting this very clear picture that people who end up in hell and people who end up in heaven, that they play a very important part in terms of the choice. And I don't want to get into all the reform stuff about that because on this level, it was very clear that the revelation that Sarah revealed to him was something that he made a choice against. He made a choice against it. He knew it. He saw it for what it was, and he rejected it. And at the end of the day, whether you're Reformed or Arminian, that still is what it comes down to. That on some level, there was a rejection of God. And so there is a rejection of heaven. There's a rejection of God-likeness here on the part of the dwarf. You dare to laugh at it, it stormed, to my face, and this is my reward? Very well. It is fortunate that you give yourself no concern about my fate. Otherwise, you might be sorry afterwards to think that you had driven me back to hell. So you can see where he's trying to make her feel guilty. He's trying to manipulate her. What? Do you think I'd stay now? Thank you. I believe I'm fairly quick at recognizing where I'm not wanted. Quote, not needed, quote, was the exact expression, if I remember rightly. From this time on, the dwarf never spoke again, but still the lady addressed it. Dear, no one sends you back. Here is all joy. Everything bids you stay. But the dwarf was growing smaller while she spoke. Yes, said the tragedian, on terms you might offer to a dog. I happen to have some self-respect left, and I see that my going will make no difference to you. It is nothing to you that I go back to the cold and the gloom, the lonely, lonely streets. Don't, Frank, said the lady. Don't let it talk like that. But the dwarf was now so small that she had dropped onto her knees to speak to it. The tragedian caught her words greedily as a dog catches a bone. Ah, you can't bear to hear it, he shouted with miserable triumph. That was always the way. You must be sheltered. Grim realities must be kept from your sight. You, who can be happy without me, forgetting me, you don't want to even hear of my sufferings. You say, don't tell you, don't make you unhappy. Don't break in on your sheltered, self-centered little heaven. And this is the reward. So again, he's trying to make her feel guilty and to communicate to her that she really doesn't care about him because she won't do what he says, because what he needs is what he says, but she knows better. She stooped still lower to speak to the dwarf, which was now a figure no bigger than a kitten, hanging on the end of the chain with its feet off the ground. That wasn't why I said don't, she answered. I meant stop acting. It's no good. He's killing you. Let go of that chain even now. So that projection, that false image of who you really are, that's killing you. You're not coming to terms with who you really are and what you really need. Acting, screamed the tragedian. What do you mean? The dwarf was now so small that I could not distinguish him from the chain to which he was clinging. Now, for the first time, I could not be certain whether the lady was addressing him or the tragedian. Quick, she said, there is still time. Stop it. Stop it at once. Stop what? Using pity, other people's pity in the wrong way. We have all done it a bit on earth, you know. Pity was meant to be a spur that drives joy to help misery, but it can be used the wrong way around. It can be used for a kind of blackmailing. So we've seen this, haven't we? And we see this, I think, even in our culture today, where there are groups of people, demographics, who seek to leverage pity in a way to manipulate people into the kind of action that they want, even though that action may not be good for them. So this is what she's saying, how pity can manipulate people. And so, you know, there are other terms for which there's not much in the way of distance between them. So when you say pity, someone else might use the word grace. Someone else might use the word justice, kindness. So there are synonyms that people might use in relationship to the action of pity in order to manipulate people in a particular way, even though you fundamentally believe that may not be good, what is good for those people. Those who choose misery can hold joy up to ransom. So, you know, while there are many people who cannot help their circumstances in life, they can help how they respond to those circumstances. And while there are many for whom they choose not to take responsibility for their actions, and so bad things happen, and when bad things happen, then they demand pity. And they demand that you help them, that you fix them in their circumstances in a way that they want, maybe not in a way that is best or good for them. So, you know, as you see this then, remember, she is the creature of heaven now. And if you were to go back into chapter 12, and recall just the stark beauty, the incredible contrast of what she looked like in heaven in her glorification versus what this tragedian and this dwarf look like now. This phenomenal contrast between the two. And yet he would have her become like him. He knows what is best for him, even though she looks like what she looks like. He resents the fact that she looks like that and demands that she become more like him if she really loved him. She would become like as he is. So that's part of what's going on here. Those who choose misery can hold joy up to ransom by pity. You see, I know now, she says, even as a child, you did it. Instead of saying you were sorry, you went and sulked in the attic because you knew that sooner or later one of your sisters would say, I can't bear to think of him sitting up there alone crying. You used their pity to blackmail them, and they gave in the end. And afterwards, when we were married, oh, it doesn't matter. If only you will stop it. And that, said the tragedian, that is all you have understood of me after all of these years. I don't know what had become of the dwarf by now. Perhaps it was climbing up the chain like an insect. Perhaps it was somehow absorbed into the chain. No, Frank, not here, said the lady. Listen to reason. Did you think joy was created to live always under that threat? And so, you know, so the only thing that matters is his misery. And the only thing that matters is that other people allow themselves to be manipulated by his misery. The only thing that matters is that everything else be suspended so that he could use whomever in order to get what he wants. So the sisters or whoever that he had when he was younger, they became codependents. They enabled him to become as he is because they just couldn't bear, as he sulked up in the attic, they just couldn't bear to have him up there crying. They thought they were loving him, and they were not. "No, Frank, not here," said the lady. "Listen to reason. Did you think joy was created to live always under that threat? Always defenseless against those who would rather be miserable than have their self-will crossed? For it was real misery, I know that now. You made yourself really wretched. That you can still do, but you can no longer communicate your wretchedness. Everything becomes more and more itself. Here is joy that cannot be shaken. Our light can swallow up your darkness, but your darkness cannot now infect our light." So this is the great challenge of the Christian faith, right? When we engage the world, are is it more of the world in us, or is it the Christ likeness of us in the world? And so, because there's too much of the world in the Christian and in the church, it's impacted our ability to be, successful, to have a lot of efficacy, or as much as we should. So, to borrow from this imagery, in heaven, light can swallow darkness. And in heaven, darkness has no capacity to swallow any light. "No, no, no, come to us. We will not go to you. Can you really have thought that love and joy would always be at the mercy of frowns and sighs?" So if it's real love, if it's true joy, it can never be manipulated by frowns and misery and sighs. I mean, imagine how our parenting might change if that were true, if we exercise that. How many of us succumb to our children, to our grandchildren, to friends because they are miserable and they want to rob us of true joy and true love. And they demand that we surrender true joy and true love in order to authenticate their misery. See, we can't do that. We just can't do that. Did you not know they were stronger than their opposites? And this is just so cool, this thought. In fact, it's what we're going to get into later on in the chapter that we will not have time to talk about today. But that anything opposite of love and joy is, even though they are opposites, they are not equal opposites. All right. So did you not know they were stronger than their opposites? So hate is not stronger than love. Grief is not stronger than joy. Both of those things can be very powerful, but true joy and true love are far, far stronger than either of their opposites. And so we tend to think of those kind of as in a yin yang kind of formula, that it's an equal number. There's an equal size of white and there's an equal size of black. It is not that. So true love is vastly bigger than the opposite of true hate. And true joy is vastly bigger than true misery. Okay, because it belongs to God. Love, how dare you use that sacred word, said the tragedian. At the same moment, the tragedian gathered up the chain, which had now for some time been swinging uselessly at his side, and somehow disposed of it. I am not quite sure, but I think he swallowed it. So the dwarf was consumed by this image of himself, this projection of himself. So the real dwarf was consumed by the false image of himself. That's what's going on there. Then for the first time it became clear that the lady saw and addressed him only. Where is Frank? She said. And who are you, sir? I never knew you. Perhaps you'd better leave me, or stay if you prefer. If it would help you, and if it were not possible, if it would help you, and if it were possible, I would go down with you to hell, but you cannot bring hell into me. So she's saying, if it were possible, I go to hell to get Frank. But what is not possible is that you cannot bring hell to me. You do not love me, said the tragedian in a thin, bat-like voice, and he was now very difficult to see. I cannot love a lie, said the lady. I cannot love the thing which is not. I am in love, and out of it I will not go. This is an incredibly powerful principle for every Christian, that we cannot love a lie. That whatever the world calls us to believe a lie and to love it, we cannot do that. And that is the thing that probably separates us from the world, or ought to separate us from the world more than almost anything else. There was no answer. The tragedian had vanished. The lady was alone in that woodland place, and a brown bird went hopping past her, bending with its light feet the grasses I could not bend. Presently the lady got up and began to walk away. The other bright spirits came forward to receive her, singing as they came. And so there goes into this kind of this poem here that Lewis writes, but I think is too long, and so you're welcome to read it if you want. So, but we go on to say, he goes on to write and says, and yet, said I to my teacher, when all the shapes and the singing had passed some distance away into the forest, even now I am not quite sure. Is it really tolerable that she should be untouched by his misery, even his self-made misery? Well, no, I suppose I don't want that. I'm sorry. Is it really tolerable that she should be untouched by his misery, even his self-made misery? MacDonald replied, would you rather he still had the power of tormenting her? He did it many a day and many a year in their earthly life. Well, no, I suppose I don't want that. What then? I hardly know, sir. What some people say on earth is that the final loss of one's soul gives the lie to all the joy of those who are saved. So in other words, because one soul is lost, the fact that others are saved must be a lie, is what he's saying here. You see, it does not. I feel in a way that it ought to. That sounds very merciful, but see what lurks behind it. What? The demand of the loveless and the self-imprisoned, that they should be allowed to blackmail the universe, that till they consent to be happy on their own terms, no one shall taste joy, that theirs should be the final power, that hell should be able to veto heaven. Do we not see this today in spades? That that no one can be happy, that no one can have joy, that no one can uh, that until everybody else is made happy the way they want to be made happy, nobody else can be happy. And if they are, it's because of some kind of oppression. It's because they lack empathy. It's because they don't care. It's because they're selfish only. It's because of those things. So he goes on to say, I don't know what I want, sir. Son, it must be the other way around. Either the day must come when joy prevails, and all the makers of misery are no longer able to infect it, or else forever and ever the makers of misery can destroy in others the happiness they reject for themselves. I know it has a grand sound to say, you accept no salvation, which leaves even one creature in the dark outside. But watch the sophistry, watch that philosophy, or you'll make a dog in a manger the tyrant of the universe. But dare one say, is it horrible to say that pity must ever die? You must distinguish the action of pity. You must distinguish the action of pity will live forever, but the passion of pity will not. The passion pity, the pity we merely suffer, the ache that draws men to concede what should not be conceded, the ache to flatter when we should speak the truth, the ache that the pity that has cheated many a woman out of her virginity, and many a statesman out of his honesty, that will die. It was used as a weapon by bad men against good ones. Their weapon will be broken. So let me read this again, because recalling what I said, if you were to add to this all of those synonyms that you could associate with pity, kindness, grace, justice, all of those kinds of things, if you associate those words with the word pity, then let me read this again. You must distinguish. The action of pity will live forever, but the passion of pity will not. The passion of pity, the pity we merely suffer, the ache that draws men to concede, which should not be conceded. In other words, because, okay, I'll give in because I feel badly, even though I don't feel right about it, I'm still going to let you do this. And to flatter when they should speak the truth. So, you can't help it. It's not your fault. You're really accomplished. When really that's not, because, that's not really what that person is. The pity that has cheated many a woman out of her virginity. I'll leave that to your imagination. And many a statesman out of his honesty. So, because he has a kind of pity or passion of pity for some constituents, then he legislates in certain ways that should not be legislated. It's not right. It's not what is good. It's not what is really true or fair or just. But the passion of pity is what controls his legislative action. It was used as a weapon by bad men against good ones. Their weapon will be broken. And what is the other kind? The action of pity. It is a weapon on the other side. It leaps quicker than light from the highest place to the lowest to bring healing and joy, whatever the cost to itself. It changes darkness into light and evil into good, but it will not, at the cunning tears of hell, impose on good the tyranny of evil. I mean, think about the relevancy of this. But it will not, at the cunning tears of heaven, impose on good the tyranny of evil. Every disease that submits to a cure shall be cured. But we will not call blue yellow to please those who insist on still having jaundice, nor make a midden of the world's garden for the sake of some who cannot abide the smell of roses. We're not going to turn the world upside down just because somebody feels badly about something. We're not going to say that because that's their view of themselves and that's what they think they need, even when we know it's wrong, we are not going to concede that. We are not going to give it up. You say, okay, so I'm going to stop here, and this will just be the part 1 of this chapter. But you can see what Lewis is doing here. You can see that when Sarah Smith encountered the dwarf and the tragedy in Frank, that Frank was undeterred. That in order for him to be satisfied, she must surrender heaven in order to become like him. And because she wouldn't, he went back to hell. And the main character is saying, but she didn't even seem to be like upset. Where's the compassion here? Where's the pity? And so MacDonald is saying, look, you have to understand that there isn't anything that is from hell that has the capacity to impact anything that is from heaven. That's not even close. It's not even remotely possible. So, heaven has the ability to go to hell and to rescue those in hell. But hell has no ability to go to heaven and to make any part of heaven like hell itself. It's impossible. And so he goes on to explain that in a very powerful way. And then they have quite a conversation about this idea of pity, compassion, what is just, what is good, what is right, from an earthly perspective. And so MacDonald is unrelenting that we can't that the passion of pity cannot be allowed to change what is true, what is good, what is right, to surrender all of those things in order to make a person or a group of people feel better about themselves. If it means surrendering what is joy, what is love, what is good, can't do it, can't happen. So that's where we are in this particular chapter. And then this next portion of the chapter is among the most of everything I have ever read. It is among the most favorite of my pieces of literature I've ever read in the history of my life. It's just phenomenal. It's phenomenal. So I hope that you join us. If you can't join us personally, that you make sure that you take the time to listen, because it is truly an amazing piece of writing and perspective that has influenced my thinking, and I can't begin to tell you how many ways. And I think that Lewis is absolutely correct on a goodly portion of that. So I'll see you next Wednesday or Thursday. I'll make sure that I put out some kind of a communique regarding that. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, and you have a great day. Bye-bye.